Absolutely not. One of the reasons why Professor Snyder may suggest that Bandera and OUN were fascist organizations is because Professor Snyder, despite being a very good academic, has a bias, and his bias is pro-Poland. His initial work was with Poland. He has written numerous essays on the subject of Poland. And the fact of the matter is, and it may be, I'm certainly not someone who can analyze someone's motivation. Perhaps Tim Snyder is a friend of Ukraine today because of Poland's need for an independent and democratic Ukraine. A number of Polish leaders, Polish presidents, in fact, have stated unequivocally that if there won't be in the future an independent and democratic Ukraine, Poland will suffer very greatly because Poland will be, unfortunately, next on the agenda for the Russians. We have a common enemy here. That enemy is Russian imperialism. The Polish people have suffered tremendously from Russian imperialism, and so have the Ukrainians. And Ukraine's biggest ally, in fact, the first country that recognized Ukrainian independence in 1991 was Poland. And this is despite all of the differences, historical differences in the past. My mom passed away a year and a half ago. She was 50% Polish, but she was a Ukrainian by choice in the sense that she was 50% Ukrainian, 50% Polish, but she chose to be Ukrainian. And if you had spoken with her, her animosity towards the Poles was as great as her animosity towards the Russians. The fact of the matter is that Poland occupied Ukraine 3 times in its history. Ukraine never occupied Poland. Now, let's consider OUN, which was formed in 1929. It consisted essentially of people from Western Ukraine, and its initial mandate, was to fight to free Ukraine from Poland. Its second mandate was to fight to free the rest of Ukraine from the Soviet Union. And when the first Congress took place in Vienna, a lot of the attacks upon the organization were from Russia and Poland, and they swore that this was a fascist organization and that people should have absolutely nothing to do with it. And later on, I'm not surprised that Poland continued this propaganda because the OUN was involved with a number of terrorist acts, assassinations against Polish political leaders. Stepan Bandera gave the order to kill Pieracki, who was a Polish minister, because Poland had carried out a policy of pacification in Ukraine, whereby they attempted to destroy the Ukrainian nation as a people and to make them as much a part of the Polish culture. In fact, Poland occupied Lviv, but for the longest time insisted that Lviv was a Polish city. Now, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, they addressed this canard that it was a fascist organization, and they were very much familiar with what fascism was. And the simple answer is because fascism had sprouted in Italy, and it was widely known throughout Europe, right? Everybody, the people who created the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists many of them were intellectuals. They knew about the world movements, and they specifically distanced themselves from fascism. And the way, very simply, they said that we are not, unfortunately, in a position to talk about building a state. We are currently involved in a national liberation struggle. Fascism is a form of government. We haven't reached that stage yet. So we are certainly not fascist. We are a national liberation struggle. We are not forming any government, nor are we forming a state. We are striving to attain a state. And they said that, I mean, fascism may be considered in the future, but certainly fascism has nothing to do with the agenda of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists. If you look at the initial program of the OUN, there's an entire list of purposes of the organization. And when it talks about building a Ukrainian independent state, it spends, the organization, the Congress, spent 6 sentences on that issue. Only 6 sentences, because they had no idea what type of a state it was going to be. They knew that it would have to be a state of the people, of the Ukrainian people. But they didn't say whether it was going to be a democracy. Amazingly enough, among its social programs, in the very first document, they spoke about an 8-hour workday, which was, in my opinion, quite progressive in those days. But if you look at the program of the Ukrainian of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists in 1943, following its third Congress, it specifically spoke about forms of government, and it spoke about a democratic form of government. So nowhere, in no document ever in the history of the OUN, is there a reference to the OUN or Ukraine becoming a fascist state. In fact, they distanced themselves from fascism. Now, Tim Snyder is a friend of the Ukrainian people. Motivation aside, I have no idea why that is. He may be genuinely a good person and may be interested in having an independent Ukraine. He also has a Polish agenda, and it's within the Polish agenda, all right, to have an independent Ukrainian state. At the same time, he despises the OUN and he despises the UPA because they fought against the Poles. They were the enemies of the Poles. In fact, in Poland, to be called the Banderowicz, they called all Ukrainians who resided in Poland, they called them Banderowcy, all right, essentially the same followers of Stepan Bandera. Interestingly enough, Timothy Snyder, he published an essay on the subject of Akcja Vісла, which was a police action that was carried out in 1947 by the Polish communist government, all right, against the Ukrainian people who lived, because a portion of Ukrainian ethnographic territory is now a part of Poland. And it was under communist times. In fact, when the Polish communist state was formed, Lemkiewszczyzna fell within the boundaries of Poland. And in 1947, they conducted a genocide of the Ukrainian people, because genocide doesn't mean that you necessarily have to kill everyone, nor does it mean that you have to succeed. Genocide, according to the Convention of 1948 of the United Nations, the Convention against against genocide, specifically says it's an attempt to destroy or liquidate a nation, a race, so forth and so on, in different ways. You can kill them. You can deport them. You can relocate, dislocate them. And with all due respect, to Professor Snyder, this was an attempted genocide. However, he wrote about Akcja Vісла. He wrote about it as a negative thing that the Poles did towards Ukrainians, but he refused to recognize it as genocide. And at the same time, he suggested that it was retribution for what the Ukrainian insurgent army did to the Poles in 1943, 1944 in Volhyn. Volhyn is a section of Ukraine that was heavily concentrated by Polish colonizers. And there was a war going on. And there was a small portion of that war was a war between the Ukrainian insurgent army and the Armia Krajowa of Poland. And it was a guerrilla war. Both sides were based on a guerrilla form of fighting, meaning they depended largely on the local populations who assisted them in this war. Even, young boys helped in the fight. Young girls helped in the fight, similarly to what went on in Ukraine during Soviet times. And the fact of the matter is that many Poles perished in Volhyn as a result of this war. Many Ukrainians perished, but a significantly larger number of Poles were killed in that war. And the reason why it was a larger number is because there were so many more Poles in Volhynia at that time. So I'm not suggesting that it's okay to kill civilians, but if a civilian is working towards guerrilla warfare on behalf of Armia Krayova, the Ukrainian insurgent army had no choice. And that's one of Tim Snyder's biggest problems in this regard. He doesn't see the Volhynia situation as Polish colonizers and the role of the Armia Krayova. He only sees the wrongs that were perpetrated by the Ukrainian insurgent army. Now, there's another problem with, and I don't mean to impeach his credibility as an academic, because I think that he's a very good academic. He's very good for the Ukrainian people. He's a very intelligent man, but he professes that he knows 10 or 11 languages to the point where he is capable of reading and looking into the archives of which are written in those languages. And I'll give you a personal situation where I had a confrontation with Timothy Snyder. He specifically wrote that the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, now he is renowned for not using primary sources. He doesn't go into archives. He uses secondary sources, and the reason why he uses little-known secondary sources because he knows the 10 or 11 languages, which is very good and very beneficial. But in this particular instance, he was sloppy, and I told him that he was sloppy because what he did is he read in the Mirchuk book, which is a book about the history of the OUN. Mirchuk was a historian, Ukrainian historian, and he wrote about the formation. In fact, his first volume is about the period of the OUN from 1929 until 1939. And he wrote about the formation. Part of the formation of the OUN, which came about some 4 or 5 months after the first Congress in Vienna, were the 10 commandments of Ukrainian nationalists. And within the 10 commandments, it says that the first one says that you will obtain or attain an independent Ukrainian state, or you will die in battle for that state. And the 7th commandment says that you will not be afraid to take on the most dangerous task if such is necessary under the circumstances. This was the final version of that 7th commandment. However, there had been a discussion about that 7th commandment and before the final version was accepted. And within the confines of that discussion, a proposal had been made to say, you will not hesitate to commit the greatest crime rather than the most dangerous act, if such is the need on that particular occasion. And Tim Snyder quoted one of the proposals that had been circulated but was never adopted. And I specifically confronted him on this issue. And I said, you're sloppy because you read Mirchuk, but you didn't read it to the end. It's in a footnote. You read the portion which was in regular print, but you should have read the footnote. And you didn't read the footnote. And in fact, I think I hurt his feelings in that regard. I'm not suggesting that he's a poor academic, but the fact of the matter is that if you know 10 or 11 languages, you're not going to be particularly erudite in all 11 languages, all right? And if your work is in secondary, you do make mistakes, okay? That is that argument of that 7th commandment. He used that argument as proof that the OUN was a fascist organization. Well, there's ample documentation right now, because if a serious historian went through all of the documents of the OUN UPA, they wouldn't find any document, not one single document that makes either organization fascist, because Snyder is not, he's very pro-Polish, much as he is pro-Ukrainian, but he's Ukrainian because he is pro-Polish. And Poland's biggest enemy during the war, before the Soviets came, was OUN UPA. Because Poland, there are polls to this very day that say Lviv is a Polish city, okay? There are portions of Western Ukraine they feel are Polish places. There was a bitter struggle about the cemetery in Lviv, where the Poles, the young Poles who fought to take over Ukraine in 1919 are buried. Okay, we have a joint history, and because the OUN UPA made, essentially, in my opinion, they made Ukrainians conscious of their national allegiances. All right, they made them aware of the fact that they are not Little Russians, they're not Malorossi, or they're not Poles. All right, because there were so many mixed marriages. My mom, like I mentioned, she was 50% Polish. All right. There was Poles lived. They predominated in the city of Lviv when the pogroms took place against the Jews in 1941. Over 60% of the population of the city of Lviv was Polish. The Poles were everywhere. How many Kościoły were there? Poles were at one time, they were imperialist, frankly speaking. They occupied Ukraine 3 times. I mentioned this before. But ultimately, what will end, if it will ever end, and I'm not suggesting that it will, because I unfortunately believe I'm optimistic normally, but as far as Russia is concerned, I'm very pessimistic. The reason why Russia has to continue this process, the reason why Russia will always be imperialistic towards Ukraine, and there's a very good reason for it, because much of what Russia has in terms of culture, Christianity, Orthodoxy, came from Kyiv, okay? The fact of the matter is that one of the descendants of a Kievan prince founded Moscow. And then from Moscow, Russia is sent, Moscovia, and then Russia eventually sprouted. Even the name Russia comes from Ukrainian Kievan Rus. They took the name Rus and they made it Russia because they insist that we are one people. Only they are the older brother and we are the younger brother. And it's not an animosity. It's a psychological problem that it has been carried over from generation to generation. The fact of the matter is that what Putin is doing throughout the world is obscene, but his support within Russia is somewhere in the vicinity of 90%.